This 19th century botanical survey page has survived longer than the forest system it describes. That was the detail I could not ignore. The page still records fruit trees, nut trees, palms, medicinal plants, and other useful species occupying the same landscape. The evidence remains fixed, and yet at some point its meaning became harder to recognize. I initially read it as a scientific record of plants found in nature. Then I considered the concentration of useful species. The longer I stayed with the document, the more the distinction between natural forest and managed landscape began to feel inadequate. Modern research provides the essential context. Many indigenous societies shaped forests through repeated, long-term practices. They did not necessarily replace ecological diversity. In many cases, management and biodiversity existed together. Nothing on the sheet has been physically erased. The disappearance of these landscapes was gradual. Different forces operated at different times and in different places. Colonial expansion changed access to land. Settlement disrupted local practices. Commercial agriculture and industrial forestry favored simpler, more uniform systems. The page does not contradict that explanation. It makes the consequences feel stranger. Physical evidence can survive without preserving the way people once understood it. A document may remain catalogued and protected while the system it describes is reclassified, simplified, or forgotten. So the real investigation is not only into how food-producing forests were transformed, it is into how history can preserve an object and still lose the knowledge required to read it. The document that prompted this investigation was published in London in 1853. It was titled Palm Trees of the Amazon and Their Uses, and its author, Alfred Russel Wallace, had spent 4 years traveling through the Amazon basin. Like many 19th century naturalists, Wallace collected specimens, described landscapes, and attempted to classify the unfamiliar world he encountered. But one feature of his work deserves closer attention. He did not simply identify palm species, he carefully recorded what local communities did with them. That detail changes the way the entire book can be read. Every page describes relationships rather than isolated plants. One palm produced edible fruit, another yielded oil. Others supplied fibers for rope, leaves for roofing, trunks for construction, or seeds that could be carved into tools and ornaments. Young shoots became food. Sap became drink. The forest appears not as a wilderness filled with anonymous vegetation, but as a landscape whose resources were deeply understood. The most revealing word in the title is not palms, it is uses. The book is often remembered as a botanical survey, yet it also preserves evidence of a sophisticated ecological economy. Wallace repeatedly encountered useful species near villages, riverbanks, pathways, and places where people had lived for generations. He was documenting plants, but without intending to, he was also documenting the long relationship between people and forests. This creates an important historical question. Were these useful trees simply growing where nature placed them? Or had generations of human decisions gradually shaped what later explorers assumed was untouched forest? The document cannot answer that question on its own. Wallace was not conducting archaeology, nor was he attempting to reconstruct centuries of indigenous land management. But his observations become difficult to dismiss when viewed alongside modern research. For a long time, European observers divided landscapes into familiar categories. There were forests, fields, gardens, plantations, and wilderness. Cultivated land displayed visible order. Straight rows, cleared boundaries, and fenced plots signaled deliberate management. Forests, by contrast, appeared to represent the absence of human design. Many indigenous land management systems did not fit those categories. Instead of replacing forests, they often worked within them. A useful tree might be protected while surrounding vegetation was cleared. Fruit-bearing species could be encouraged near settlements. Seeds might be planted along frequently traveled routes. Selective burning opened sunlight for desirable plants while limiting others. Small, cultivated clearings could later return to forest, carrying with them the biological consequences of human decisions. None of these actions transformed the landscape overnight. Each was modest on its own, but repeated over generations, they could gradually alter the composition of an entire forest. To an outsider, the result still looked wild. The trees were irregular, the canopy remained intact. There were no obvious fences or neat agricultural rows, yet beneath that appearance, probabilities had changed. Useful species occurred more often than chance alone would predict. Certain combinations of plants repeatedly appeared near former settlements. Productive groves survived long after houses disappeared. The forest concealed its own history. This explains why so many 19th century records seem surprisingly familiar today. Wallace's observations were not unique. Across tropical America, Africa, Southeast Asia, Oceania, and North America, explorers repeatedly described forests rich in edible, medicinal, and economically valuable plants. They encountered palms, fruit trees, nut-bearing species, fibers, resins, and medicinal vegetation that local communities used systematically. The systems themselves differed enormously. Some surrounded permanent villages, others followed seasonal patterns of movement. Some combined cultivated plants with hunting landscapes. Others developed through centuries of selective protection rather than deliberate planting. There was no single global model. Yet, a common principle appeared again and again. Food production did not always require replacing a forest. Sometimes it required guiding one. Modern historical ecology has allowed researchers to examine these older observations in entirely new ways. Rather than separating human history from ecological history, scholars began comparing archaeological sites with living vegetation. They studied charcoal preserved in soils, microscopic plant remains, pollen, settlement patterns, and the modern distribution of useful species. One discovery proved especially significant. In Amazonia, forests surrounding archaeological sites consistently contain unusually high concentrations of domesticated or culturally important trees. Research published in 2017 found that tree species domesticated by pre-Columbian societies are far more likely than other species to become abundant near ancient settlements. The findings do not suggest that the entire Amazon was planted, nor do they suggest that every useful tree was deliberately cultivated. Instead, they demonstrate something both more cautious and more remarkable. Human influence can remain visible inside a forest centuries after the societies responsible have been disrupted. The forest retains a memory, not through written records, not through monuments, but through the survival and distribution of living species. Brazil nut trees, peach palms, acai, inga, cupuaçu. These and many other species reflect long histories of protection, cultivation, movement, and selective encouragement. Some were fully domesticated. Others benefited indirectly from clearing, burning enriched soils, or repeated harvesting practices. The important point is not that every tree was planted. It is that the modern forest often preserves evidence of human decisions that later generations no longer recognize. Once that possibility becomes visible, Wallace's 19th century survey begins to read differently. It is no longer simply identifying palms. It is preserving fragments of a landscape whose ecological history extended far beyond the expedition that recorded it. And that raises an even larger question. If forests capable of feeding entire communities once existed across so many regions of the world, what happened to them? The answer was not a single event. There was no moment when someone decided that food-producing forests should disappear. Instead, these landscapes encountered a new way of thinking about land. For the communities that managed them, a forest could serve many purposes at once. It produced food throughout the year. It supplied medicines, fibers, fuel, timber, game habitat, and materials for daily life. Different species matured in different seasons. Some trees were planted by one generation, and harvested by the next. Productivity was measured over decades rather than annual harvests. Colonial administrations often viewed the same landscape very differently. Governments wanted clearly defined property. Surveyors wanted boundaries that could be measured. Plantation owners wanted land dedicated to a single profitable crop. Foresters classified trees according to their commercial timber value. Tax systems favored production that could be counted, recorded, and exported. A diverse forest supporting dozens of useful species could sustain an entire community, yet still appear economically unproductive to an administration searching for fields, plantations, or merchantable timber. The problem was not that colonial officials failed to recognize useful plants. Many botanical surveys described them in remarkable detail. The problem was that the value of these forests was dispersed across hundreds of relationships. Food was gathered at different times of year. Medicines came from multiple species. Construction materials, fibers, oils, fruits, nuts, and game all emerged from the same landscape. That complexity was difficult to fit into systems designed around ownership, taxation, and export commodities. As colonial expansion continued, customary systems of land management were increasingly disrupted. Communities were displaced by warfare, disease, forced labor, and settlement. Traditional access to forests was weakened by new legal definitions of property. Controlled burning, an essential management practice in many regions, was prohibited or discouraged. Seasonal movement became more difficult. Knowledge that had once passed naturally between generations was interrupted. None of these processes occurred everywhere in the same way. The history of Amazonia differed from that of North America's Pacific Northwest. Southeast Asia followed different trajectories from West Africa. Every region experienced its own sequence of political, economic, and ecological change. Yet, across these very different histories, a similar pattern emerged. The plants often survived longer than the systems that had maintained them. An old fruit tree could continue producing for decades after the people who cared for it had gone. Palm groves remained. Nut trees continued to mature. Berry patches still flowered each spring. To later visitors, these places appeared entirely natural because the human practices that had shaped them had already disappeared from view. This delayed disappearance made the transformation surprisingly difficult to recognize. If an agricultural field is abandoned, its decline becomes obvious. A forest garden follows a different timeline. The oldest trees remain standing. Animals continue feeding beneath the canopy. Fruit still ripens. The landscape appears healthy, but subtle changes begin almost immediately. Young trees are no longer planted where older ones die. Selective harvesting ends. Controlled fire ceases. Competing vegetation gradually changes the balance of species. Paths close beneath new growth. Knowledge of flowering seasons, harvest cycles, and medicinal uses fades with each generation. The forest remains green. The management system quietly disappears. This explains why so many 19th century records preserved evidence without preserving understanding. Botanical collections cataloged plants. Herbaria stored specimens. Museums preserved objects carved from wood or seeds. Libraries protected expedition journals. Maps recorded settlements. Each institution carefully preserved one fragment of a much larger landscape. But the relationships connecting those fragments slowly disappeared. Botany studied the species. Forestry measured timber. Agriculture examined crops. Archaeology investigated settlements. Ethnography documented cultural practices. Rarely were these separate archives brought together to reconstruct the entire system. Only in recent decades has historical ecology begun reconnecting these lines of evidence. Instead of asking whether forests were either natural or artificial, researchers now investigate how long-term human activity influenced ecological change. The answer is rarely simple. A useful tree may have been deliberately planted. Another may have been protected while surrounding vegetation was cleared. Animals may have dispersed seeds around settlements. Burning may have created favorable conditions for certain species. Communities may also have chosen to settle where valuable plants already grew. Several processes often operated together. That complexity strengthens the evidence rather than weakening it. Historical ecology does not argue that every forest was created by people. It rejects the assumption that forests without fences were necessarily untouched by human history. This distinction matters because it changes how we interpret both the past and the present. Today, agroforestry is frequently promoted as an innovative response to biodiversity loss, degraded soils, and climate change. Modern systems combine trees with crops, improve soil fertility, reduce erosion, and support wildlife while continuing to produce food. The scientific methods are contemporary, but the underlying principle is not. For thousands of years, Indigenous communities around the world managed landscapes where food production and ecological diversity reinforced one another instead of competing. Modern agroforestry is not a direct recreation of those historical systems. Different climates, cultures, legal institutions, and ecological conditions make that impossible. Traditional knowledge cannot simply be extracted from history and applied elsewhere like a technical manual. Yet the comparison remains revealing. Many ideas now presented as innovative solutions have deep historical precedents. The greatest lesson may not concern agriculture at all. It concerns memory. Returning to Wallace's botanical survey, nothing on its pages has changed. The illustrations remain the same. The scientific names remain the same. The descriptions of local uses remain exactly as they were printed in 1853. Only our interpretation has changed. At first glance, the book appears to describe wild palms. Read more carefully, it becomes a record of ecological knowledge. Viewed alongside archaeology, ecology, and indigenous history, it becomes evidence that forests can preserve the legacy of human management long after that management has ceased. We still cannot determine who planted every tree. We cannot reconstruct every generation that shaped those landscapes. Nor should we assume that every concentration of useful species resulted from deliberate cultivation. The evidence does not support those conclusions. What it does support is something equally significant. The old division between agriculture and wilderness was often too simple. Human societies did not always replace forests in order to feed themselves. Many learned to work within them. So why were the food forests destroyed? Not because of a hidden conspiracy, not because of a single empire, a single law, or one decisive moment. They disappeared through overlapping historical processes that unfolded differently across the world. Colonial expansion disrupted indigenous societies. Disease reduced populations. Settlement transformed land ownership. Commercial agriculture favored uniform crops. Industrial forestry simplified diverse ecosystems. Urban growth consumed older landscapes. Knowledge transmission was interrupted. Economic systems rewarded immediate, measurable production over long-term ecological complexity. Some forests were cleared, others were logged. Others gradually lost the people who understood how to maintain them. The result was the same. Living landscapes accumulated through centuries of knowledge became increasingly simplified, and where the trees remained, the cultural understanding that gave them meaning often did not. That is why Wallace's book still matters. Not because it reveals a forgotten civilization or a hidden secret. It matters because it preserves ordinary observations that generations failed to interpret fully. The evidence was never completely lost. It sat on library shelves, archived in botanical collections and scientific institutions, waiting for new questions to be asked. The forests did not disappear without witnesses. The witnesses carefully described what they saw. Only now are we beginning to understand what they were actually looking at.